basically what we want to do here is go through and make sure that you guys remember these rules. Also remember that any notes that you take, you're allowed to use on a test and quiz. So if you take good notes here, you keep this in your folder. When we take a test or a quiz next week, we're going to take a quiz next week. We'll take a test at the end of the triad. You can use these notes. So you have these rules. You'll have access to them. And there's really no reason for not knowing this stuff, because if you forget it, you can go look it up in your notes. All right, that's the idea here. The very first one says subtraction is the same thing as blank, and there's actually 3 blanks there. This is an important thing to remember, and I kind of gave you a hint here when I said rules for adding, and then I put subtracting in parentheses. So subtraction is really the same thing as adding. I kind of gave part of it away. As what? No. Subtraction is the same thing as adding a negative. You guys remember that? So this is an important rule because if we think about things like this, well, let's just say 7 minus 2. It tells us that this 2 is really not a positive 2, but it's a negative 2. All right? So this problem right here means the same thing. I should put an equal sign there. Means the same thing as 7 plus negative 2. So it's important to understand that when we're subtracting, it's really just adding a negative number. So a subtraction problem means that one of the numbers is negative. And that's important to remember. Okay? So if we have something like 9 minus 5, that's the same thing as 9 plus negative 5. When we're adding and subtracting, if both numbers are positive, so if they're both positive, are we going to add or subtract? We're going to add. All right, so if both numbers are positive, we're going to add. And the answer is going to be what? Is it positive or negative?
Negative.
If both numbers are positive, then the answer is going to be positive. Okay? If both numbers are negative, are we going to add or subtract? We're going to add. Remember, if they're both negative, we still add. You guys remember that from the opener yesterday? Okay? And the answer is going to be positive or negative? Negative this time. So if both numbers are negative, if we have something like negative 2 plus negative 3, we add the 2 and the 3 together and get 5. But if it's a negative 2 and a negative 3, it's going to be a negative 5 when we combine them, or when we add them. All right, so something like 9 plus 5, we add them together, and the answer is positive. We get positive 14 there. If we have something like negative 9 minus 5, because remember this problem, it wasn't this same problem, but a problem like this from the opener yesterday. They're both negative, right? So we add them together and get 14, but is it a positive 14 or a negative 14? It's a negative 14. All right. When subtracting, which number always goes on top?
The small number.
I did skip one, didn't I? Okay, we'll come back to it. When subtracting, which number always goes on top?
Oh, the big number.
The bigger number. The bigger number has to go on top. And you guys remember when you're subtracting, you remember how to borrow? If you have something, let's say that we have something like 23 and we do minus 47. Okay? If we're going to do something like this, in the ones place, we can't do 3 minus 7, right? So we would have to borrow, make that a 13, make this a 1, and we can do 13 minus 7 now and get 6. But now we can't do the 1 minus 4, right? And the problem is we don't have anything to borrow from. So the bigger number has to be on top, otherwise we're going to run into this problem where we need to borrow but we can't. All right, so we can't put the smaller number on top when we're trying to subtract. All right, so the bigger number always needs to go on top. When we're doing something like this, we have a negative and a positive. When we do a negative and a positive, we're going to subtract. Which one needs to go on top, though? Is it the positive number? Should 5 go on top?
Negative.
Yeah, the negative because it's bigger, right? So the bigger number has to go on top. So when we subtract this, we would have to put the 23 on top. Same thing here. If we were subtracting these, one's positive, one's negative, so we know we have to subtract. Which one's going to go on top? The negative 14 or the 37? The 37 goes on top, so we would write it like this to subtract it. Okay, and we don't need to go through that. You just need to know to do that. So going back to this one, if one number is positive and one is negative, then are we going to add or subtract? Subtract. Remember, the first two we did, if they're both positive, we add. If they're both negative, we add. But if they're different, then we subtract. And this time, we have to do a little bit of thinking to know if the answer is going to be positive or negative. It's not like when we multiply. When we multiply, there's a simple rule when we have one positive, one negative. How do we know if the answer is going to be positive or negative when we subtract? So we look at the two numbers. Whichever one is bigger, we use that sign. So the answer is... well, it has the sign. You guys know what I mean by sign? Sign means positive or negative. So it has the sign of the bigger number. The sign means positive or negative. So sign is just a plus or a minus, positive or negative. Now, when we're subtracting, we always put the bigger number on top. And when we're subtracting, the answer is going to have the sign of the bigger number. So whichever number you put on top, if it's positive, then the answer is going to be positive. If the number on top is negative, then the answer is going to be negative. So in this example here, we have a positive and a negative, right? Which one's positive? Which one's negative? The 5, right? Okay, so the 9's positive, the 5's negative. So which one do we put on top? The 9 or the 5? The 9 goes on top. Why? Because it's bigger. So we put the 9 on top. The 5 goes on the bottom, and that's negative. So we would set it up like this. We have 9 minus 5, which is 4. Positive 4. Now, why is it positive 4? Because the 9's the bigger number. Remember, whichever number you put on top, if that's positive, the answer is positive. If this was negative, then the answer would be negative. So if we look at this one, we have negative 9 plus 5. The 9's still going to go on top, right? Because it's still bigger. So the 9 goes on top, but that's negative. The 5 goes on the bottom. Yeah.
Negative 4.
So we're still going to subtract. We still get 4. But it's going to be negative 4 because the 9's bigger and the 9's negative. So whichever number's on top, if that's negative, the answer is negative. If that's positive, then the answer would be positive. Does that make sense? Okay. Subtracting a negative. This is the last thing that goes with this. Subtracting a negative is the same thing as doing what? Let's say we have something like 9 minus negative 5. It's the same thing as adding, yes. Okay, so subtracting a negative is the same thing as adding. And so what we can do here, this is the way I like to show it. You can do it however you want, but I like to just circle both of the negatives and make it a plus sign. So that's the same thing as 9 plus 5. Which is what? 14. So 9 minus negative 5 is 14. So I'd like you to take a moment, if you haven't already, I noticed that some of you are doing this already, But go ahead and do these problems. I want you to set each one of these up as a stack. You guys know what I mean by stack? So put one number on top and one number on the bottom. So like on this one, well, they're both positive, right? So we're going to add or subtract? Add. When we add, does it really matter which one goes on top? No. So you could write it either way. I'll just put the 23 on top since that's first. So it's going to be 23 plus 42. And then go ahead and add them together. Okay? For the ones that you have to subtract, be sure you put the bigger number on top. We put the 23 on top, we put the 42 on the bottom. Now when we add, how do we do that? What do we do first? Should I do the 2 plus 4 first or the 3 plus 2 first? Yeah, we're going to start in the ones column. You guys remember what the ones column is? These are ones. What are these? Tens. All right, so we start over at the ones. We start all the way to the right. And we add them together. 2 plus 3 is 5. Nothing to carry, so we can just move over to the tens. 2 plus 4 is 6. And so our answer is it positive or negative? Positive. There's nothing in this problem that would make that negative, right? Okay, on this problem, we have a negative 17 and a positive 19. So are we going to add or subtract? We're going to subtract because one's positive, one's negative. All right, when we subtract, which one needs to go on top? The 19 because it's bigger. So we have the 19 on top, the negative 17 on the bottom. And just like when we added, we start in the ones. You want to help me out? Okay, what's 9 minus 7? 2. Okay, what's 1 minus 1? What? So, what's 1 minus 1? What's 1 minus 1? We're in the tens. 1? Is that what you said? 1 minus 1 is 1? Alright, so 1 minus 1 is 0. Do I need to put the 0 here? No. Because 02 is the same thing as just 2, right? So I can leave that off. Now, the question is that going to be a positive 2 or a negative 2? I heard both answers. It's positive. Okay, I like to think about it this way. Since the bigger number is on top, I can just look at the bigger number. That's positive. So the answer is positive. So we get a positive 2. Okay, the next one. We have a negative 41 and a positive 14. So are we going to add or subtract? We're going to subtract because one's positive and one's negative. Remember, anytime we have one positive and one negative, we subtract. Which one's going to go on top, though? The 41 needs to go on top. Okay, I like to make sure I keep that negative on the 41. And then we'll just put the plus 14 here. But don't get confused by this. This doesn't mean we're adding, because we have a positive and a negative. So we need to subtract. What's 1 minus 4? Yeah, we're going to have to borrow, right? So I'm going to borrow here, make this an 11, make this a 3. What is 11 minus 4? 7. And what is 3 minus 1? 2. So we get 27. Is that a positive 27 or a negative 27? That's going to be a negative 27. For the negative 16 minus 15, are we going to add or subtract? We're going to add. They're both negative, right? Remember, if you forget, you can just look back at your notes. It says in your notes, if both numbers are negative, then add. So we need to add these. I'm still going to stack them. When I add, does it matter which one goes on top? No. So I'm going to put the negative 16 on top. I'll put the negative 15 on the bottom. And I'm going to add because they're both negative. What's 6 plus 5? 11. Should I put an 11 here? Okay, put the 1 from the 1's place, carry the 1 from the 10's place. 1 plus 1 plus 1 is 3. And is that going to be a positive 31 or a negative 31? Look at your notes. It says, if both numbers are negative, then add, and the answer is negative. Should say that in your notes. You should have written that down. If both numbers are negative, you add them together, and the answer is negative. Now, who can tell me why is the answer negative when we have two negatives?
Because it's a negative.
on the back of your notes, we're going to talk about multiplying integers. So when we're multiplying numbers together, we've got a different set of rules. Okay? When we were adding and subtracting, well, we just went through it, but two positives we add together, we get a positive. A negative and a positive we subtract, and we use a sign of the bigger number. Two negatives we add together and get a negative. Those rules are going to be different for multiplying, so be careful about this. A lot of people get these rules mixed up. So when we're multiplying, what's the rule? Positive times positive. It's going to be a positive. It's going to be a positive. Okay, what's the rule when we have a positive times a negative? That's going to be a negative. Anytime you have a positive times a negative, it's going to be a negative. How about a negative times a positive? It's also going to be a negative. In fact, it means the same thing. A negative times a positive is the same thing as a positive times a negative. So that's going to equal a negative also. We'll go back and do these examples or talk about these examples in a second. What about a negative times a negative? That's going to be positive. Okay, so we get a positive here, we get a negative here, we get a negative here, and a negative here. Oops. So we get a positive, a negative, negative, positive. Okay, so this example here, we're doing 4 times 5 on all of them. So what is 4 times 5, first of all? It's 20. So is this one going to be positive 20 or negative 20? Positive. How about this one? Negative 20. How about this one? Negative 20. Anytime we have a negative times a positive, it's going to be a negative. How about negative 4 times negative 5? That's going to be a positive 20. So a negative times a negative gives you a positive. All right? So let's do a little bit of practice here. I want you to try to do these. I skipped one again here. Go ahead and try to do these, and I'll come back to that last question. So a negative times a positive in this case is always going to give us a negative answer. All right, how about this one? Help me set it up. Which one should go on top?
Negative 12.
Yeah, I would put the negative 12 on top just because it's bigger again. And then we're going to multiply by negative 9. What's 9 times 2? What is 9 times 2? 18. So I'm going to put the 8 down here, carry the 1. What's 9 times 1? 9 times 1 is 9, plus the 1 we carried is 10. So that's going to give us a 108. Is that a positive 108 or a negative 108? Why is it positive? Yeah, when we multiply a negative times a negative, we get a positive. So you should have positive 108. All right, next one. This one should be pretty easy. Let's just do the number part first. What's 5 times 3?
15.
Okay, that's 15. Is it going to be a positive 15 or a negative 15?
Negative.
Why is it negative?
Because the negative negative times a positive is a negative.
A negative times a positive is always negative. It doesn't matter which one's bigger. Okay, we would get the same answer if we had a positive 5 times a negative 3. It would still be negative 15, even if the smaller number was negative. Okay? Negative 1 times negative 2. Let's again just do the number part first. What's 1 times 2? 2. Okay, is this going to be a positive 2 or a negative 2?
Positive 2.
Why is it positive?
Because a negative times a negative is a positive.
Negative times negative is always positive. All right. How about this one? Negative 2 times negative 3 times negative 4. What should we do here? Should we try to multiply them all out at the same time? No. Let's just go from left to right. Remember, order of operations, we do multiplication and division from left to right. So let's just do negative 2 times negative 3. What's 2 times 3? 6. What's a negative times a negative? A positive, right? So what we end up with here is 6 times negative 4. Okay, what's 6 times 4? 6 times 4 is 24. Is that going to be a positive 24 or a negative 24? It's going to be negative because a positive times a negative is going to be a negative. Okay, last one. Same thing here. So we're going to just go left to right. 6 times 7 is 42. Is that going to be a positive 42 or a negative 42? It's going to be negative because it's a positive times a negative, right? And then we have to multiply that by 8. Now, to multiply 42 times 8, I can't do that in my head. So, what do we do? What's that? Okay, how do we do it?
You do 2 times 8. 8 times 2.
So to figure this out, we're going to stack it. So we put the negative 42 on top. We put the 8 on the bottom. We're multiplying them together. So we're going to do 8 times 2, which is 16. Carry the 1. 8 times 4 is 32. If you forget it, it'll be in your multiplication chart. So 32 plus the 1 we carried, 33. So we get 336. Is that going to be a positive 336 or a negative 336? It's going to be negative because we had a negative 42 times a positive 8. A negative times a positive is always negative.